All right, we're good.
Okay, welcome back. Gavin and I are here to discuss the preface, the introduction, and the first two chapters from Richard Wrangham's book, which is called The Goodness Paradox, A Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. And the purpose of this book, in some ways, is to apply a lot of the concepts, ideas, and to apply evolutionary theory, evolution by natural selection, to humans and to non-human primates. It's very clear that there's a focus on humans in this book. But that's really the goal, is to take what we've learned from Dawkins and apply it to various features of human psychology and behavior, notably violence as it occurs among humans, as well as the flip side of cooperation and sort of getting on with one another. So, can you still hear me there, Gavin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. A couple of quick notes. This is the second and final book that we'll review and discuss for this class. This is really where we'll spend more time talking about animal behavior proper in this book than we did in Dawkins's book. That is talking about how to apply these ideas to animal psychology and behavior. And again, by animal, I mean, we certainly include humans. Although you'll see that much of the focus in this book is on humans and non-human primates, chimpanzees and bonobos in particular. So for this week, we are asking you to view, and you'll hear more about this after this lecture. Gavin will be posting links to this. One is a lecture that Richard Wrangham delivered that basically summarizes in about an hour sort of the meat of this book. He sort of lays out his arguments and sort of in one fell swoop gives you a sense of what's to come in the next few chapters. So I think it's very helpful because it sort of sets the stage and will help you sort of put a context to what we'll be reading and discussing each of the next few weeks. So there's the Wrangham lecture. It's a lecture he delivered at Harvard not that long ago. Of course, the book is fairly new. And then we're going to ask you to listen to a podcast that Wrangham did with Ricardo Lopez, I believe is his name. And he runs a podcast called The Dissenter. And he's a very, very thoughtful interviewer. And it's a really sort of informal discussion of a lot of what we'll be talking about in the next few weeks. So we hope you'll find both of those sort of additional media, the podcast and also the lecture. Hope you'll find them interesting and useful. I think you will. Otherwise we wouldn't have assigned it, of course. But again, it gives you a chance to hear about this material in a different context. One sort of a more formal lecture and the other a more informal but still well-informed podcast. So you'll have a link to those shortly. And Gavin, is there anything you want to say about the discussion questions, the responses, or the reaction papers?
No, other than that, they're still going very well. Everyone seemed to, even if they didn't love the Dawkins reading, were still fighting with it and struggling with it, and engaging with the concepts of the last chapter in ways
Excellent.
that I thought were interesting. So no, yeah, it's all good.
Excellent. Well, that's all we can hope for. I mean, that's sort of the goal, is to get, I mean, we've said this many times, but I'll say it again. I mean, I can't tell you how important it is for students, in terms of doing well in the course and understanding the material, to stay engaged. And when you have to, when part of your grade turns on submitting discussion questions and submitting responses to other students' discussion questions and writing a reaction paper, it's hard to remain utterly out of the loop. And it's difficult to write such questions, and it's difficult to write a reaction if you haven't at least carefully skimmed the reading. We're not encouraging you to skim, we're encouraging you to read. But part of what I'm saying is, if you keep up with the program, you are going to do well in this course. Everybody who's turned in, who's submitted discussion questions and responses as requested and on time, same for the reaction papers, I can assure you, you're getting 100% in the class. If you are doing everything that we're asking you to do, you're doing extremely well. And you will, it may not seem like it at this point, but you will accidentally get a very good overview of animal behavior. And you will be well positioned to do extremely well in the final, which is sort of the last piece of the grade in the course. So, all right, enough of that. Let's talk about the book.
Yep.
Okay, so we did ask you to read the preface, and if you haven't done that yet, please do. I think it's 2 pages, and it sets the stage for the book. And the bottom line is, Wrangham is a primatologist. He studies primates. Including humans, but non-human primates have been his focus for the past nearly 50 years. He was a student of Jane Goodall's, and most of his career has been spent studying chimpanzees in the wild in Africa. And he became very interested in how to understand human aggression, human violence from an evolutionary perspective, and how to understand human violence with reference to violence as it occurs in chimpanzees, and more recently, as it occurs in bonobos. I say more recently because bonobos are a much more recently identified variant of chimpanzees. They're very closely related, but they are distinct species. The common chimpanzee and bonobos. Bonobos are also referred to as pygmy chimpanzees. They're a little bit smaller. All of which is to say, Wrangham became fascinated with how it is that, and this is really the paradox, is how to understand the extraordinary cooperative abilities of humans. There's no doubt that humans can be remarkably cooperative, remarkably tolerant of one another in close confines, and put up with a lot of irritations that never would be put up with by chimpanzees, for example. And so he became very interested in what to him seems to be a paradox, that we are both extraordinarily cooperative, his term here in a few cases is virtuous, cooperative, while also being extraordinarily violent. Violent not towards our in-group members, but towards out-group members, towards those that we exclude from our sphere of moral concern. So that's really kind of the setup. The book, before Wrangham is already well known as a scientist, but he wrote a wonderful book that I've used in this class before called Demonic Males, and the subtitle was Apes and the Origins of Human Violence. It's an outstanding book focused on the violence side of things. In particular, this book certainly makes reference to violence, but it also brings in what I think is a really crucial point, which is that yes, humans are capable of tremendous violence, but we're also capable of extraordinary cooperation. So, just a plug for Wrangham. He's one of these really, really sharp guys who's also a very gifted writer. Do you have any comments, Gavin, on the preface? Anything you want to add, or anything that sort of struck you as worth commenting on?
No, in the preface, I think the main takeaway is just sort of his, Wrangham's explaining his background in primatology, because I think it helps put everything else in context, knowing that.
For sure. So let's move to the introduction, virtue and violence in human evolution. Now, really, this chapter is just sort of unpacking, a sentence or two from the preface. This chapter is laying out his initial case for there being something worth writing about. And that's really what you want to do in an opening chapter, is to sort of make the case to your reader that there's something peculiar about humans. at least modern humans. This ability to cooperate, extensively, to behave in ways that we would sort of informally call virtuously, but also to be exceptionally violent. And there's a couple of places I'll point out. He says it quite briefly here on this happens to be on page 3. It's actually the opening page of the introduction. He says, in short, he says, we can be the nastiest of species and also the nicest. And I think it's worth, appreciating that this is really the crux of this book. He's going to make the case that we can be an extraordinarily nasty species in terms of the violence that we inflict on others, while also simultaneously, that is, while also being a species that is very capable of behaving in an extremely cooperative way. And it may seem like this is obvious, but it's not obvious to most academics. It's not obvious to most primatologists. What you often see, and this is part of what he hints at in the introduction, is you see the field split along people who want to argue that humans are, basically nice, for example. And then it's that, crowding and modern, sort of modern Western life is what ruins us and causes us to become violent. But at base, we're really good and virtuous. Then you see an entirely different group of people, a group of scholars who argue, no, we're basically nasty. And it's only by virtue of our exposure to civilizing forces and to governments and to, religion, for example. You've heard many of these kinds of arguments that's the only way in which we can get along with one another. So you see, there really are, historically, there have been these two very entrenched camps, that humans are basically good and are only capable of violence because of, the terrible, because of the nasty influences of civilization and crowding and so forth. Then you have an entirely separate group who feels just as strongly that humans are basically nasty and violent, and are only capable of good behavior with the civilizing influences of things like religion, government, and so forth. And what Wrangham is suggesting is that, no, we are both. We are equally violent and virtuous. But these different behaviors are deployed in different contexts.
Yeah, and he sets up a similar... I think he talks about a similar sort of... I guess he'd probably call it a misstep in research where, primatologists try to assert that humans are either more closely related to chimpanzees or bonobos for similar reasons, right? Because chimpanzees are relatively more aggressive than bonobos. And again, he makes the case that, trying to focus on either one of these species, either chimps or bonobos, but not both, is also a mistake. It's also sort of missing the point.
That's right. Yeah, you're right. So on page 9, he says, he says the behavioral contrast between bonobos and chimpanzees, he says, are a piece with the central question animating this book. Why are humans both highly tolerant, like bonobos, and highly violent, like chimpanzees? Okay, I mean, we're a bit of an odd duck here, among these three species. And he then goes on to point out, so he's sort of setting up the rest of the book, and he makes reference to each one of the chapters that follow. But he says, we are low on the scale of one type of aggression, and he's going to call this reactive aggression, and high on the scale of another type of aggression, which he's going to call proactive aggression. And then he gives you different terms to associate with reactive aggression. This has been called hot aggression, or losing your temper, or lashing out, or freaking out. I mean, that kind of aggression is very typical of chimpanzees, for example. Okay, they're very intolerant. We tend to be exceptionally tolerant. Now, he's not arguing that humans aren't sometimes violent. Of course they are. But the things that cause humans to pop off, okay, are few and far between, relatively speaking. Whereas with chimpanzees, they're constantly irritating each other and constantly behaving violently towards one another. They're very intolerant. Chimpanzees are very high in reactive aggression. Humans are very low on reactive aggression. On the other hand, we're very high in what he wants to call proactive aggression, planned aggression, deliberate aggression, sort of biding one's time, sort of developing a strategy for how you're going to, inflict violence. Humans are, unfortunately, very, very good at this. Okay. One of the things he's going to argue is he's going to make reference to the fact that, and this is going to occur in chapter 4. He's going to explain that there are a variety of new theories that are linking the evolution of physical features, such as, let's see, let me back up just a little bit. He's going to ask us to consider the distinction between wild animals and domesticated animals. Okay? And he's going to suggest that bonobos represent a domesticated version of an ancestor that bonobos share with chimpanzees. In short, that bonobos are, again, just for analogy, are kind of like domesticated chimpanzees. They're relatively tolerant. They're relatively nonviolent. They're relatively more cooperative than our chimpanzees. And so there's a sense in which, and he'll make the case at length, that bonobos are domesticated. Now, of course, nobody domesticated them. They self-domesticated. Okay, and we'll get into that. And what he's going to argue is that humans also are self-domesticated, that we are a domesticated version of an ancestor that we share with other hominid species. And he's going to use Neanderthals as, that is Homo neanderthalis, another human species, as the relatively wild and wild sort of species of humans. If we are domesticated or self-domesticated, then it might be relevant to compare our psychology and behavior with what we know about Neanderthals, who are relatively less domesticated. So he's going to ask, so he asks, if humans are like a domesticated species, how did we get that way? Who could have domesticated us? And of course, as I've suggested, he's going to make the case that we are self-domesticated.
Yep. Yeah. And he explains, I think, so I guess for first-time readers of this book, at sort of this point, it may seem odd, why Wrangham is choosing to use the term domestication. And I think he'll make that clear when he talks about the similarities between self-domesticated species like ourselves and bonobos and selectively bred animals like dogs, cattle. And he'll talk about the domestication syndrome, which is a set of physical attributes that seem to coincide with lower reactive aggression, or sort of the docility that is seen in other domestic species. And he'll argue that we share not only these behavioral similarities, but also the physical ones as well. And he'll not only sort of present a body of evidence that makes it, look convincing, but he'll also propose a theory as to how we could have possibly domesticated ourselves, but that's, later in the book. So
yes. Okay, so why don't we talk about then chapter 1? We've essentially, I think we've addressed much of what we wanted to say about the paradox, right? I mean, that's the title of chapter 1, the paradox. So this is just making it razor clear what this paradox is. And I think, to be honest, I think he does a nice job of summarizing it in the final sentence of this chapter. He says here, high rates of killing, no, this is the final paragraph, high rates of killing or other forms of violence are not inevitable. And there is much variation among societies and over time. He's referencing humans here. But overall tendencies are clear. Compared with other primates, okay, we, that is humans, modern humans, practice exceptionally low levels in our day-to-day lives. Okay? Yet we achieve exceptionally high rates of death from violence in our wars. That discrepancy is the goodness paradox. Okay? So we have exceptionally low levels of violence in our day-to-day lives. And that's true even if you compare, let's not pick on Detroit. Let's say inner city Chicago homicide, okay, where it's among the highest in the nation. Those homicide rates, and we've all heard a lot about them, homicide rates in the largest urban areas in the United States, yes, we talk about how they're so high. They're very high, but they're shockingly low compared to the homicide rates of most tribal cultures that have ever existed. And these are modern humans. Or if you look back at the homicide rate of humans, let's say 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 500 years ago, and people have done this. Most recently, Steven Pinker, in a book called Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. He makes, an incontrovertible case that violence and homicide have, in fact, declined remarkably by magnitudes of order. Okay? What I'm saying is, whether we recognize it or not, we actually are, compared to other primates, especially compared to chimpanzees, and even compared to bonobos. Humans are remarkably nonviolent towards one another in our day-to-day lives. Okay, so you have to be able to hold these two ideas in mind at the same time. On the other hand, our intertribal warfare, our warfare, okay, or our violence against those outside of our group, blows away any other species, okay, including chimpanzees and bonobos and wolves and ants and any other, species that people want to suggest is extraordinarily violent. It's humans that are the champions of homicide, of murder, of killing in the context of intergroup conflict. So the question is, how can this be?
Right.
How is it that we are both capable of extraordinary cooperation, unbelievable social tolerance of within group members, generally speaking, and yet also capable of, supremely well-designed proactive aggression?
And he talks a little bit about statistics at some point in, I think, this chapter, and how that, I don't want to unnecessarily confuse anyone, but he does,
Yeah.
I think, raise some good points, saying that, you would look at the statistics and you would think that the instances of reactive aggression are actually higher. But he talks about sort of a few biases and who's likely to get caught. Obviously, people committing impulsive reactive aggression, especially when it leads to murder, are more likely to be caught than people who plan out their murders ahead of time. So there's a little bit of a bias there.
Sure.
There's also, I think what you were saying earlier put it well, that when war does flare up, the instances of death, and that would be a result of proactive aggression, balloon
Right.
and are much higher. So a civilization not at war, it would appear as though instances of reactive aggression and reactive murder, they would appear higher, but he, I think, goes to, on page 29, especially, is where a lot of the, it looks like he lists some statistics. He sort of explains why that's a bit of a misconception. So that's helpful.
Yeah. So basically, but you're moving into chapter two types of aggression.
Oh, were we not? I thought we moved into chapter 2.
I didn't yet, but that actually is fine because it all sort of, it all obviously, sort of bleeds together. I mean, that's the mark of a good book, is that, there aren't, sort of these stunning brick walls you run into at the end of one chapter and then into the next. So that's right. He makes, a very clear case, and it's not his distinction, but there is and has been a broad distinction between these two types of aggression: reactive, what he wants to call reactive, and proactive. That is what he calls them, right? Reactive, yeah, reactive and proactive. And this is crucial, to understand this distinction. So he talks about reactive aggression as a response to a threat. Okay. He says reactive aggression is variously described as hostile, angry, impulsive, affective, or hot. Okay, this is like freak out aggression. This is, it occurs in humans. Okay, no one's denying that it occurs in humans. But even the most reactively aggressive humans appear all but docile compared to chimpanzees. Okay, on balance, and it's important to keep these various ideas in mind. So relative to other non-human primates, and specifically relative to chimpanzees and bonobos, okay, humans are relatively low in reactive aggression. That's not to say that some humans aren't extremely reactively aggressive. They are. But again, if you look across the species, we generally are relatively tolerant of one another. Okay? People aren't, even in the most violent, urban areas. You might have, okay, let's just take the United States. I think on average there's something like 20,000 murders a year in the United States, in the entire United States, a population of 350 million. Okay, now 20,000 is a big number, no doubt about it. But 20,000 out of 350 million, okay, it is a very, very low rate of homicide relative to the rates of killing that occur among chimpanzees, okay, or the rates of aggression that occur among chimpanzees. It's far higher among chimpanzees, that is.
Right.
It's also far, far higher among non-Western, sort of hunter-gatherer tribes. The rates of aggression are much higher. But at any rate, he's addressing the issue that on balance, and I think this is not controversial, on balance, humans are relatively low on reactive aggression, okay, relatively, as a species compared to, in this case, chimpanzees. Okay, so that's the key point he wants to make right there. Okay, and for proactive aggression on the other hand, humans score very high. Again, any way you assess it, and some people would argue that humans, they're off the scale in terms of proactive aggression. That's like planned, deliberate, sort of biding one's time sort of aggression. Okay, that is all but unique among humans. Not totally unique, but humans are the masters of proactive aggression, planned aggression, cold aggression, as it's often referred to. It's not that you never see this in chimpanzees, but it's infrequent, where a group of male chimpanzees will patrol their territory, and they're clearly attempting to be very quiet. They're not hooting or calling to one another. They get mad if somebody steps on a stick and makes a stick crack. Then one of them will say the equivalent of "Stop it!" "Shut up." So they seem to be in a planful sort of mind. And as it happens, if they come upon a lone male or even a lone female from a different tribe or from a different troop, they will attack. Very frequently, they will attack and beat to death that individual. So again, it suggests a planfulness. And there's disagreement about how much we can really know about what's going on in the minds of chimpanzees, but there are lots of clues that suggest they're capable of planful aggression.
Right.
Okay. so the point of this chapter is to bring everybody up to, or to ask the reader to accept for the moment this important distinction between these two types of aggression, proactive and reactive. Okay. And he goes through a variety of evidence suggesting that there are important differences in these two types of aggression in terms of, the underlying biology and neuroscience of reactive aggression as opposed to proactive aggression, in terms of the different brain areas that appear to be involved, in terms of the different neuroendocrinological substrate that supports reactive as opposed to proactive aggression. All of this is part of the puzzle that suggests these really are two different types of aggression, and that there's a good case to be made to think about them separately. Okay, the reactive aggression and proactive aggression. And you do have to spend this time because not everyone, particularly if you're not familiar with this area of work, you might think, well, aggression is aggression, violence is violence. But it's very important that you disabuse yourself of that idea and consider Wrangham's argument. And again, it's not unique to Wrangham, but it's this argument that there's something very different about these two forms of aggression, these two types of aggression.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, it's not a new sort of distinction, and I think he makes the case well when he talks about the two different legal precedents for first degree and second degree murder, or premeditated murder and not premeditated. So at least in the United States, and I think in other countries, that distinction is sort of a long-standing one, where if you there's different consequences, and there's a different, even I think, legal charge for murder that happens sort of spontaneously. And on page 33, he breaks down the current U.S. legal system, or current U.S. legal precedent for reactive aggression. And yeah, so reasonable provocation, and the defendant must in fact have been provoked, and the aggression had to occur within, an amount of time where they could not have cooled down, basically. So, like you said, hot aggression.
Yeah, that actually, so that would be, so on page 33, looking at that, so what he's laying out here is the 4 criteria for a homicide to be judged as voluntary manslaughter, right, which conforms to reactive aggression, rather than murder, which usually is what we mean by proactive aggression, right? So to the extent that there are, if there are mitigating circumstances, or, the so-called reasonable person sort of idea that, well, a reasonable person would have reacted like that, this would suggest reactive aggression that occurred without planfulness, aggression that, you just flew off the handle. And that is more likely to get, in that situation, a person is more likely to be charged with voluntary manslaughter rather than with murder. Murder is reserved for instances of clear planning, and deliberate sort of strategizing about how to kill this person. Yeah, right. So again, the broader point is our legal system itself distinguishes what Wrangham and proactive aggression. So all of this leads up to, and I think a lot of this, is he's making his case with reference to a variety of different, concepts. And again, as I mentioned, neuroendocrinology, studies of brain areas across different species. All of this leads to the reasonable conclusion that these are two distinct types of aggression. And I think he closes this chapter very straightforwardly. So I just want to look at this last couple of paragraphs. He says, all right, so aggressive behavior, this is on page 46. Aggressive behavior is influenced by genes. Proactive and reactive aggression are controlled by different neural pathways and have different scores of heritability. Something we didn't mention, but that's actually well known, is that the heritability is the extent to which the variation in proactive aggression and reactive aggression can be accounted for by differences in genes is different for the different types of aggression. So even at the level of heritability, you see differences. And then he says, and certain genes promote reactive but not proactive aggression. In the future, we can expect that twin studies, adoption studies, and studies of the genes themselves will increasingly specify separate risk factors for reactive and proactive aggression. For the moment, okay, we can say that the two kinds of aggressive behavior represent sufficiently contrasting emotional and cognitive reactions that are subject to different biological underpinnings. He says reactive and proactive aggression are therefore expected to be capable of evolving separately from each other. Okay? Just because a species is high on reactive does not mean necessarily that they're high on proactive. This is all very important for his argument. Okay? He notes that one Russian experiment found exactly that result with rats. And he referred to this. Selection of Norway rats for tameness toward people led to a reduction in reactive aggression, supported by elevated levels of serotonin. There was no change, however, in the rat's propensity for proactive aggression. Then he concludes, given that humans, compared with other species, are low on reactive aggression and high on proactive aggression, the question is why we have this mixture. Okay, he says we start our search for an answer by addressing our low propensity for reactive aggression. Among animals that are, like humans, unusually docile, again, relative to other primates, many of these other animals are domesticated. We need to find out what happens when a species is domesticated. He's now going to make the case that humans are domesticated and indeed have been self-domesticated. And so he's beginning to build his case, okay, for why humans display this, what he calls goodness paradox. Anything else you feel you might want to add, Gavin, at this point?
No, not here. I think for the information that Wrangham lays out so far, that about does it.
Okay, and again, so what we'll do next week then is we will talk about chapters 3 through 5. So he's going to introduce human domestication in chapter 3. He's going to make the case that humans are a domesticated species. Who domesticated them? We did. That is, early humans. We are a self-domesticated species, he's going to argue. Okay. Then in chapter 4, called Breeding Peace, he's going to address the issue of how species are domesticated. He's going to talk more broadly about the domestication syndrome, and he's going to make the case that it does apply to humans. He's going to contrast domesticated species with wild, with the possibility that species in the wild can be and have been domesticated. And then again, the question is, well, who domesticated them? Once again, you're left with the very real possibility of self-domestication. And that's chapter 5, Wild Domesticants. Okay? And there I believe he's going to make the case, yes, that bonobos are self-domesticated. Bonobos are like a domesticated version of chimpanzees. Okay? So all of this is building up to a larger argument that we won't spend too much time with right now because you need to sort of get there.
Right.
Okay, so we'll cover the next 3 chapters then next week. It's about the same amount of reading. It's not, hopefully you aren't finding it too taxing. And just another plug to please view those the two videos. Watch. Well, one is a lecture by Wrangham that I think is absolutely worth 50 minutes or an hour of your time to sort of set the stage for the remainder of the book. The second is the podcast that Wrangham does it's the podcast called The Dissenter, where he has an opportunity to respond a little more informally to a variety of questions about the arguments that he's making. And I think that you'll enjoy the book more and understand it a little more readily with that background, bringing that background to the next several chapters in particular. Okay?
Yep.
Very good then. We will see you next week.